The medieval city was never silent. From dawn to dusk, the cobbled streets hummed with voices, the creak of wagons, and the sharp cries of merchants hawking wares. Bakers carried steaming loaves, butchers swung cleavers over blood-stained tables, and priests in dark robes slipped through the crowds like shadows of authority. At first glance, this was a world of order, a society where every man and woman knew their place beneath the weight of God and King. Yet behind the facade of piety and commerce, there lurked another current, one whispered about in confessionals, but walked openly in the darker corners of the town, the women of the night, the prostitutes who lived on the margins of survival. Their presence was both condemned and tolerated, scorned yet necessary. For the church thundered against them in sermons, calling them agents of the devil, temptresses destined for eternal fire. But the same society that damned them also depended on them. The priest who declared fornication a mortal sin might slip into a brothel after Vespers. The merchant who sat proudly at Sunday Mass might visit a back-alley tavern before returning to his wife. And the poor peasant laborer, who could not hope for marriage until he had land of his own, might seek comfort in their arms for a handful of coins. These women were woven into the fabric of the city, though always forced to dwell in its shadows. You could find them at the edge of the market, lingering near the taverns where ale flowed until dawn. You might see them beckoning from the windows of brothels that glowed faintly with candlelight, their painted faces and silken shawls a sharp contrast to the rags of the poor. They were both visible and invisible. Every man knew where to find them, but respectable society pretended not to see. The contradictions of medieval morality gave their existence a strange legitimacy. City councils, eager for revenue, often sanctioned brothels, taxing the very sin the church denounced. In some towns, brothels stood brazenly in the heart of the city, their doors painted in bright colors to announce their trade. Elsewhere, prostitutes were herded into specific quarters, confined to streets known by names that still survive in European cities today: Rue des Juifs, Gropkant Lane, or Via del Donzel. They were part of the urban landscape as much as the guild halls and churches. Yet life for these women was precarious. To the townspeople, they were necessary but despised, treated as vessels of sin rather than human beings. Respectable wives crossed the street to avoid them. Children were warned not to look them in the eye, and still, men sought them out, in secret or without shame, driven by desire, loneliness, or sheer desperation. The women themselves often came from stories of heartbreak, daughters cast out for losing their virtue, widows left penniless, orphans with no craft to sell but their own bodies, and so they became shadows in the marketplace, moving silently among the crowds, tolerated yet reviled. They lived between the sacred and the profane, caught in the hypocrisy of a society that demanded purity from its women, but carved no mercy for those who could not meet it. To understand them is to see medieval life not through the shining stained glass of the cathedral, but through the smoke and candlelight of a brothel chamber, where laughter masked hunger and survival wore the mask of desire. Their lives were not simply stories of sin. They were stories of resilience, of women navigating a brutal world with the only weapon left to them, their bodies. They were survivors in a system that had closed every other door. Their existence revealed the fragility of medieval order, the gap between the ideals preached from pulpits and the realities of human need. And though the chronicles of kings and popes rarely speak their names, their presence was as vital to the medieval city as the butcher, the monk, or the merchant. They were the silent undercurrent beneath the marketplace's noise, the whispered scandal at the dinner table, the hidden sin that touched every class of society. To tell their story is to peel back the polite veil of medieval life and see the raw truth beneath. A world where survival came at a price, and where the price was often a woman's body. No little girl in the Middle Ages grew up dreaming of standing on a street corner at midnight, calling to strangers with a painted smile. Prostitution was almost never a choice born of desire, but of desperation. To understand why these women entered the trade, we must peel back the layers of medieval society and see the cruel realities that left them with so few paths for survival. At the heart of it was poverty. The medieval economy offered almost nothing to women without protection. A widow whose husband died of plague or war often lost not only her partner, but her livelihood, as the right to farm land or maintain a shop passed to male relatives. Orphaned girls, cast adrift without inheritance, faced starvation unless they found work as servants. But those positions were scarce, and abuse by masters was common. A servant impregnated by her master might be cast out, her reputation ruined, with no dowry, no husband, and no path but the streets. Marriage itself, the supposed shield for women, was fragile. Husbands abandoned wives when crops failed, or when a woman's body could no longer bear children. Some men left for war and never returned, leaving women in limbo, neither widows nor wives. For these women, survival meant trading the only resource society still valued from them, their bodies. Yet not all prostitutes were driven purely by ruin. Some chose the trade to claim a sliver of independence denied to other women. Within the walls of a regulated brothel, they might earn more coin than a washerwoman or maid could hope to see in a year. They could buy silks, jewelry, or at least a hot meal, and in rare cases, even purchase their freedom from poverty. Though society reviled them, they could sometimes live with more autonomy than a peasant's wife bound to endless labor under her husband's gaze. Still, that independence was precarious, balanced on the whims of men and the judgments of law. A prostitute might enjoy fleeting wealth, but she was always one bad season or one brutal beating away from ruin. Disease lurked in every encounter, and age was an enemy no woman could escape. The younger and more beautiful might find patrons among wealthy merchants, or even knights, but most were destined for back alleys and taverns, where coins were tossed like scraps of bread to a beggar. Some entered the trade through coercion, victims of pimps, brothel keepers, or even their own families. Chronicles tell of fathers who sold daughters to pay debts, of mothers who nudged their girls into brothels when famine made food scarce. In desperate times, the line between survival and exploitation blurred. These stories reveal the cruelty of a society where a woman's body could be treated as both commodity and currency. And then there were the runaways, girls who fled brutal husbands, cruel masters, or convent walls. For them, prostitution was not merely a last resort, but sometimes the only path to freedom. To the outside world, they were sinners, but within their own hearts, perhaps it was the first taste of self-determination they had ever known, however harsh the cost. The reasons were as varied as the women themselves, yet all roads led to the same shadowed streets. Whether through widowhood, poverty, coercion, or defiance, prostitution became the net that caught those whom medieval society had abandoned. It was a net woven of shame and necessity, yet it kept countless women from sinking into starvation's grip. Their stories remind us that sin was often less a choice than a sentence imposed by circumstance. Behind every painted face in the tavern, there was a tale of loss, hunger, or betrayal. Each woman carried with her the echoes of a life that might have been different had fate or fortune dealt her another hand. And so the city's brothels and alleys filled with women who were not villains or seductresses, but survivors, trapped between condemnation and necessity. Step into a medieval city at dusk, and you would find the streets alive with flickering torches, the smell of roasting meat, and the hum of tavern songs. Yet down certain alleys, where shutters stayed closed and doors bore painted symbols, another world revealed itself: the brothels. These establishments, though cloaked in sin, were as much a part of the city as the church steeple or the guild hall. They thrived under the uneasy balance between public morality and private desire. In many towns, brothels were officially sanctioned by civic authorities. City councils reasoned that if lust could not be eliminated, it must at least be contained. Better, they argued, to confine it within the walls of a controlled house than let it erupt into the streets, threatening respectable wives and daughters. Thus, the brothel became an institution, a paradoxical marriage of sin and regulation. In places like Nuremberg and Toulouse, municipal brothels were erected and taxed, the proceeds flowing into the same coffers that funded city walls and cathedrals. The appearance of these brothels varied widely. Some were sprawling houses with multiple rooms, lit by candles, and filled with the smell of wine and incense meant to mask sweat and smoke. Others were little more than timber shacks at the edge of town, their walls thin, their air thick with filth. Yet within both, the same theater unfolded. Women painted their faces with ash or crushed berries, donned garish gowns, and offered themselves to men who sought comfort, release, or simple escape. In Venice, brothels were part of the city's pulse, so widespread that officials tried to regulate where they could operate, often near bridges or canals, ironically close to churches. In Avignon, the papal city itself, brothels flourished under the shadow of the church. Even in London, the Bishop of Winchester himself controlled the infamous Southwark stews, licensing prostitution and profiting from sin. Such arrangements reveal the hypocrisy of medieval power. While the pulpit thundered against lust, the authorities quietly counted their earnings. Inside, the atmosphere was a strange blend of festivity and menace. Minstrels sometimes played in the corners while men drank heavily, their laughter rolling through smoke-filled halls. Some brothels served food and drink, blurring the line between tavern and flesh market. Others maintained a colder formality, where women lined up silently and men chose like cattle at market. Prices varied according to the woman's beauty, youth, or nationality. Exoticism sold well, with chroniclers noting that foreign women often fetched higher fees. Not all brothels were equal. Some catered to nobles and merchants, offering private chambers with velvet cushions and perfumed sheets. Others served peasants and laborers, where straw mattresses and a swig of sour ale were the height of luxury. A handful of women rose to become courtesans, wielding influence through wit, beauty, and connections. But for the vast majority, the brothel was little more than a prison of necessity. The brothel was also a place of danger. Violence simmered under its roof: drunken brawls, beatings, even killings. Prostitutes lived at the mercy of their keepers, who often took the lion's share of their earnings. Disease spread easily in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. And yet, despite these dangers, the brothel provided what the streets could not: a roof, some measure of food, and a thin illusion of protection. For the women inside, the brothel was not just a house of pleasure, but a crucible of survival. Behind the laughter, the painted smiles, and the flicker of candlelight, it was a place where dreams withered and resilience hardened. And for the medieval city, it was both a shameful secret and a necessary release, tolerated in whispers, condemned in sermons, yet thriving in plain sight. If brothels were the stage, then the customers were the restless audience, drawn by need, desire, or sheer boredom. In the medieval city, clients of prostitutes came from every rung of society, their coins heavy with contradictions. To imagine prostitution as a trade only for the lowest classes would be a mistake. It was a mirror of the whole community, reflecting the sins of all who lived within its walls. The most common patrons were laborers and peasants, men who toiled from dawn till dusk and returned with aching bodies and pockets jingling with a few coins. For them, a visit to a prostitute was often less about lust than about fleeting relief from the grind of poverty. They could not afford dowries, often could not marry until much later in life, and so they sought intimacy in alleys and taverns, buying with pennies what society otherwise denied them. Merchants, too, frequented the brothels, their purses fat from trade. After long journeys along muddy roads or river barges, they sought the warmth of women as reward for their endurance. In some cases, they became patrons, keeping mistresses who lived in brothels, but enjoyed a little more comfort thanks to steady support. Chronicles tell of deals struck in these smoky halls, where a night of pleasure was paired with a handshake that sealed a business arrangement. Then there were the soldiers, loud, drunken, and feared by many women in the trade. When armies passed through a town, brothels swelled with customers, and those without coin often tried to pay with intimidation. Authorities sometimes attempted to regulate soldiers' visits, fearing both disorder and disease, but regulation meant little to men carrying swords and armor. For prostitutes, soldiers were both plentiful clients and constant threats. Perhaps the most shocking patrons were men of the cloth. Priests, monks, and even bishops were whispered about in connection with brothels. Some cloaked their visits in secrecy, slipping through back doors under the cover of night. Others were brazen, as in Southwark near London, where prostitutes lived under the very license of the bishop himself. The hypocrisy was stark. The same men who thundered about sin from the pulpit could be found kneeling at the bedsides of women they condemned. Nobles, too, were not absent. For them, visiting a prostitute was often less about necessity and more about thrill or indulgence. Some sought women of specific renown, high-class courtesans known for wit and beauty who could converse about politics as well as offer their bodies. Such encounters blurred the line between lust and companionship, a strange parody of courtly love played out behind closed doors. In every visit, however, there was danger. Men feared disease as much as they desired pleasure. Physicians of the time wrote extensively about the risks of venereal infections, though their remedies were often little more than superstition. Still, fear did not stop them. The lure of forbidden flesh was stronger than the shadow of sickness. For the prostitutes, customers meant survival, but also constant uncertainty. A kind man might pay generously and leave quietly. A cruel one might strike, humiliate, or even kill. Each transaction carried risk, each night a roll of dice between coin and cruelty. Women in brothels learned to read men's faces quickly, the twitch of an eye, the curl of a lip, for in those small gestures lay the difference between profit and peril. Thus, the clientele of medieval prostitution revealed the truth of society itself. From peasant to priest, from soldier to lord, all sought what the church forbade, and the brothel sold. The brothel doors did not discriminate. They swung open for every class of man, proving that sin was not the vice of a few, but the hunger of all. For all the secrecy and scandal that surrounded prostitution, the trade was anything but invisible to medieval authorities. Far from ignoring it, towns and rulers sought to control it, weaving a tangled web of laws, restrictions, and punishments that reflected both fear and dependence. The result was a strange legal paradox. Prostitutes were tolerated as a necessary evil, yet marked, branded, and excluded from the world they sustained. In many cities, prostitutes were forced to wear special clothing that marked them as outcasts. In England, some were required to don striped hoods or distinctive cloaks, garments that set them apart in the streets. In parts of Italy, women were forced to wear yellow veils or brightly colored belts, so no respectable woman might be confused with them. These rules branded them with shame, turning their very clothing into a public confession of sin. Yet at the same time, they gave them a strange form of recognition, a silent admission that their presence was expected and even necessary. Brothels themselves were heavily regulated. Many towns restricted them to specific districts, pushing them to the outskirts or clustering them into stews along riversides. In London, the notorious Southwark stews were managed under the authority of the bishop, a sign of how entangled church and profit had become. Brothels could not open on holy days, nor near churches or schools, though in reality these restrictions were often ignored. City councils licensed them, taxed them, and used the proceeds for civic projects, even as they condemned the women within. The women were often excluded from the rights of other citizens. They could not testify in court, join guilds, or claim the protections of law. When accused of theft, violence, or spreading disease, their word carried no weight, and punishments fell swiftly. Some were whipped through the streets, branded with hot irons, or driven naked from the city walls. Others were banished, forced to wander until starvation or another town's brothel took them in. The same authorities who profited from their trade were quick to punish them for the slightest transgression. Despite these cruelties, some women sought safety in the rules. A licensed brothel, however harsh, offered more protection than the streets. There, they at least had the right to ply their trade openly, to keep some of their earnings, and sometimes even to petition local officials when mistreated. In cities like Toulouse and Cologne, prostitutes occasionally organized to defend their interests, appealing to magistrates for fairer treatment. These glimpses of resistance show that, even within a system built on control, women fought to carve out spaces of survival. Yet the regulations also revealed society's hypocrisy. Authorities condemned unlicensed prostitutes as criminals, while embracing licensed ones as contributors to public order. Men who bought their services were rarely punished, though they broke the same moral codes. It was the women, always, who bore the brunt of shame and suffering, while their clients walked free. Church courts, too, weighed in. Some ordered women to undergo penance, fasting, pilgrimage, or confinement in Magdalene houses. These institutions were meant to rehabilitate fallen women, but often functioned more like prisons, where repentance was enforced through labor and prayer. For many, the only escape from such confinement was death, or a return to the streets. The harshest punishments came in times of crisis. When plague or famine struck, prostitutes were accused of spreading disease, of corrupting the moral fabric already frayed by disaster. In such moments, mobs sometimes turned violent, driving women from their homes or killing them outright. The rules that once tolerated them vanished, and the women found themselves abandoned by the same society that had relied on them. Thus, the laws and punishments of the Middle Ages reveal a grim truth. Prostitution was neither fully banned nor fully accepted, but trapped in a limbo of regulation. These women lived under constant scrutiny, their lives balanced between necessity and condemnation. They were tolerated as long as they obeyed, but the moment they strayed, they were cast into the pit of shame, branded as the embodiment of sin. It was a life spent walking the knife's edge between survival and ruin, their every step dictated by the fickle hand of law and faith. Within the walls of the medieval brothel, life unfolded in shades of contradiction. Behind painted smiles and laughter lay stories of exploitation, fleeting tenderness, and ever-present danger. For prostitutes, love was a rare luxury, violence a constant shadow, and survival the only certainty. Exploitation began the moment a woman entered the trade. Brothel keepers, often men but sometimes widows, who had once been in the trade themselves, controlled every aspect of a prostitute's life. Women owed rent for their rooms, fees for clothing, and taxes for every coin earned. In many cases, the keeper claimed the lion's share, leaving the women with scraps. Pimps and madams promised protection, but often used coercion, intimidation, and even physical violence to keep women obedient. The illusion of choice quickly dissolved under the weight of such control. Yet amidst this exploitation, love sometimes flickered. Chronicles speak of men who fell deeply for prostitutes, paying their debts and even marrying them. In Venice and Florence, courtesans occasionally became the companions of nobles and scholars, admired for their wit as much as their beauty. These rare stories of affection were the exceptions that proved the rule. For most, love was a dangerous illusion. To believe in it could lead to heartbreak, abandonment, or worse. Still, in the dim light of the brothel, whispers of tenderness offered a fragile hope against the brutality of daily life. Violence, however, was always near. Clients, drunk on ale and lust, often turned cruel. Women endured beatings, humiliation, and sometimes fatal assaults. The law offered little protection, as their word carried no weight against that of a man. In some towns, prostitutes carried knives hidden in their bodices, not as weapons of power, but of desperate defense. The streets outside the brothel were no safer. Gangs of young men harassed women openly, mocking them, throwing stones, or worse. Their status as fallen gave license to cruelty. Disease was another form of violence, silent but devastating. Syphilis and other venereal diseases ravaged women's bodies, leaving them scarred or infertile. Few remedies existed, and those that did, herbal concoctions, prayers, or bloodletting, were more superstition than science. The women bore the blame for spreading illness, though it was often the clients who carried infection from one bed to another. To be marked as diseased was to lose even the fragile safety of the brothel. Many were cast out, left to die in alleys or plague pits. And yet, amidst the cruelty, bonds of sisterhood often grew among the women themselves. Within the brothel, they found friendship, sharing stories, food, and small comforts. Older women taught younger ones how to read men's moods, how to feign laughter, how to demand payment before service. These small acts of mentorship were lifelines, passing down survival strategies in a world where no one else would protect them. Their companionship was not merely friendship, but solidarity, a fragile shield against loneliness and despair. The paradox of tenderness amid brutality extended to clients as well. Some men returned not only for flesh, but for company, to talk with women who listened more kindly than wives or confessors. In these rare exchanges, prostitutes glimpsed fragments of affection, though always fleeting, always shadowed by the reality that coin, not love, sustained them. It was a world where kindness and cruelty coexisted, where survival meant navigating both with equal skill. For every tale of affection, there were 10 of betrayal. Women who trusted men's promises often found themselves abandoned, cast aside for younger or wealthier rivals. Those who tried to leave the trade risked violence from keepers who saw them as property. Escape was rare, and freedom often came only with age, disease, or death. The dream of love was fragile, but the brutality of exploitation and violence was enduring. In the end, the life of a medieval prostitute was lived on a razor's edge, between hunger and survival, between tenderness and brutality. Exploitation chained them, violence haunted them, yet within the darkness they still sought glimmers of love, even if only for a moment. Their resilience was not in denying the pain, but in enduring it, in surviving night after night in a world that offered them no mercy. If the brothel was the body of medieval prostitution, then the church was its uneasy conscience, condemning with one hand while licensing with the other. No institution railed louder against the sins of lust than the medieval church, yet no institution was more entangled in the profits and politics of the trade. This contradiction reveals not only hypocrisy, but also a desperate attempt to balance morality with the messy reality of human desire. The official position of the church was clear. Prostitution was a sin. From pulpits across Europe, priests thundered against fallen women, declaring their bodies to be the snares of the devil. Writers like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas argued that prostitution corrupted the soul, weakened men, and imperiled salvation. Yet even Aquinas, in his famous paradox, compared prostitution to a sewer in a palace, foul but necessary to keep filth from spilling elsewhere. It was better, he reasoned, to confine lust than to let it pollute respectable society. This reasoning led to a peculiar form of tolerance. The church condemned the prostitute but tolerated the brothel, so long as it remained confined, controlled, and profitable. In some towns, clerics themselves licensed brothels, collecting rents and fees to fund religious institutions. The Bishop of Winchester famously oversaw the Southwark stews in London, profiting from women even as sermons condemned them. Such arrangements shocked contemporaries, but they reveal the Church's willingness to embrace pragmatism when it served its interests. Prostitutes were often required to confess regularly, to perform penance, and to pay fines to the Church. Confessors urged them to leave the trade, but when women returned, as most did, priests offered absolution for a price. This cycle of sin, confession, and absolution became its own economy, a spiritual toll levied upon the bodies of the desperate. For many women, salvation was not found in the confessional, but postponed endlessly, purchased in small installments that kept their souls, like their lives, in permanent debt. Monasteries and convents sometimes played a role in rescuing prostitutes. Magdalene houses, named after Mary Magdalene, sought to rehabilitate women through strict labor, prayer, and confinement. Yet these institutions were often prisons in disguise. Women were locked away, their hair cut short, their freedoms erased in the name of redemption. For some, this was worse than the brothel, where at least they retained a fragile independence. Redemption, as offered by the Church, often felt like another form of captivity. Yet the Church's position was not merely punitive. In times of plague and famine, sermons linked prostitutes with divine punishment, portraying them as scapegoats for society's suffering. Women were accused of spreading illness, of drawing God's wrath upon the land, and sometimes were expelled en masse. At the same time, preachers reminded men that their sins, their patronage, made them just as guilty, though men rarely suffered more than a guilty conscience. The paradox deepened with clerical participation in the very trade they denounced. Scandal after scandal revealed monks and priests frequenting brothels, keeping concubines, and fathering illegitimate children. Some bishops turned blind eyes, others actively profited. For ordinary believers, this hypocrisy was plain. They watched as the same men who demanded chastity from the pulpit sought pleasure behind closed doors. The Church thundered against sin, yet it could not purge the desire within its own ranks. For prostitutes themselves, the Church was both oppressor and shield. On one hand, it branded them as sinners, denied them the sacraments, and locked them in Magdalene houses. On the other, it created a system in which their trade could survive, confined but permitted. The Church, perhaps unknowingly, became the great legitimizer of prostitution, calling it evil, yet acknowledging it as essential to the order of society. In the end, the Church's relationship with prostitution was a dance of condemnation and tolerance, sin and necessity. It could not eradicate lust, so it caged it. It could not silence desire, so it profited from it. And in doing so, it revealed its own contradictions: holy men presiding over unholy houses, sermons clashing with coin, salvation offered at a price. Prostitution was the necessary evil, but perhaps the greater evil was the hypocrisy that sanctified it. If poverty and violence haunted prostitutes in ordinary times, plague and pestilence turned their lives into a nightmare. Medieval Europe, already racked by famine and war, lived under the constant threat of disease. Prostitutes, whose work exposed them to dozens of men each week, became both victims and scapegoats, branded as carriers of corruption, blamed for illnesses they neither caused nor controlled. Even before the great outbreaks of plague, venereal diseases were a constant shadow. Though physicians of the era lacked the knowledge to identify bacteria or viruses, they recognized symptoms of sores, fevers, and wasting flesh. Prostitutes were accused of poisoning men, their bodies described in medical texts as vessels of contagion. Treatments ranged from the bizarre to the brutal: ointments of mercury, bleeding, or concoctions of herbs and wine. These often caused more suffering than the disease itself. Yet blame rarely rested with the clients who spread sickness between brothels. Instead, it was the women who carried the burden of shame and punishment. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, fear sharpened into fury. Prostitutes were accused of spreading plague through their sinful bodies, their very trade said to invite God's wrath. In towns ravaged by the pestilence, mobs sometimes turned on them, driving them from cities or murdering them outright. Brothels were shuttered in panic, yet the closures were temporary. As soon as plague ebbed, the same cities reopened them, recognizing once again the trade's necessity. The irony was cruel. Prostitutes were as vulnerable to disease as anyone else, perhaps even more so. They died in the same numbers as their clients, their bodies discarded in plague pits without prayers or rites. Yet their deaths were rarely mourned, their suffering overlooked. To society, their demise was proof of divine justice, a cleansing fire that consumed the sinful while sparing the righteous. In truth, plague struck rich and poor alike, but prejudice made it easy to cast the blame on women already marked as outcasts. Medical writings of the period often reflected these biases. Physicians advised men to avoid prostitutes if they wished to remain healthy, while paradoxically prescribing intercourse with virgins as a cure for certain ailments. Such advice spread infection rather than preventing it, but it absolved men of responsibility, leaving prostitutes to bear the stigma. Some towns even attempted to regulate brothels for public health, forcing women to undergo humiliating examinations or branding the diseased as untouchables. These measures rarely helped. They merely deepened the shame. Religion added another layer of cruelty. Preachers claimed that outbreaks were God's punishment for lust and adultery, pointing to prostitutes as living evidence of sin. In sermons, their deaths were described as warnings to the faithful. Some women, desperate to escape both stigma and plague, sought refuge in convents or Magdalene houses, trading one form of confinement for another. But for most, there was no sanctuary. Disease turned their already precarious existence into a slow march toward inevitable suffering. The scapegoating of prostitutes during times of plague also revealed a deeper truth about medieval society. In times of fear, the marginalized were always the first to be sacrificed. Just as Jews were falsely accused of poisoning wells, prostitutes were accused of poisoning bodies. Both groups bore the weight of anxieties that society could not explain and would not admit as its own. And yet, survival persisted. Even in plague years, some women endured, adapting to new dangers. Brothels reopened, clients returned, and the cycle of exploitation resumed. Disease, for all its devastation, could not erase desire, nor the structures that profited from it. For prostitutes, the plague years were both catastrophe and continuity. Death and disease stalked them, but so too did the unchanging demand that ensured their trade survived even the darkest days. Thus, disease and plague did more than wound their bodies. They branded their souls in the eyes of society, making them scapegoats for disasters far beyond their control. In their suffering, the cruelty of the medieval world is revealed. A world quick to exploit, quicker to condemn, and slowest of all to show compassion. Behind the heavy doors of brothels and the whispers of the streets, the hidden lives of prostitutes unfolded, lives filled with contradiction, resilience, and fragile freedoms. Though they were outcasts in the eyes of society, within their private world they forged bonds, developed strategies, and even found moments of independence in ways that surprise us today. The brothel, oppressive as it was, could sometimes serve as a refuge. It gave women shelter from the dangers of sleeping rough in alleys or wandering roads alone, where robbery or rape were constant threats. Within its walls, they formed communities. Women shared food, clothing, and advice. An older prostitute might guide a younger one through the tricks of negotiation, how to insist on coin before service, how to flatter a customer into paying more, how to feign desire without yielding real vulnerability. These small acts of mentorship were lifelines, carving order out of chaos. Some women managed to wrest small freedoms from their circumstances. By carefully saving their earnings, a difficult feat under the weight of fees and taxes, they could eventually purchase their release from a brothel keeper. A few even bought homes of their own, or ran small taverns, reinventing themselves as respectable widows or innkeepers. These were rare victories, but they reveal a stubborn thread of independence woven through even the darkest fabrics of exploitation. There were also women who wielded unexpected influence. High-class courtesans, especially in cities like Venice or Paris, sometimes became confidants of nobles, artists, and scholars. They were prized not only for their beauty, but for their wit and ability to converse about politics, poetry, or philosophy. Such women occupied a strange position, shunned by polite society, yet courted in secret by its most powerful men. In their chambers, words and bodies mingled, shaping relationships that could sway fortunes. Freedom, however, was often fleeting. The same independence that allowed a woman to rise could vanish overnight. A jealous lover might abandon her, a brothel keeper might tighten control, or a new law might drive her back into poverty. Many who escaped once found themselves returning, trapped by hunger or debt. Still, the memory of freedom, even if brief, carried hope. It proved that life did not have to be only chains and shadows. Even leisure and laughter had their place in these hidden lives. Prostitutes sang together, shared jokes about foolish clients, and found solace in one another's company. In carnival seasons, when the streets overflowed with masquerades, they sometimes joined the festivities, hidden behind masks that allowed them to mingle as equals, if only for a night. These fleeting joys were acts of defiance, small rebellions against a society that sought to strip them of dignity. Love, too, was not entirely absent. Though fraught with danger, some women found genuine affection in unexpected places, with fellow workers, with clients who became companions, or even with the children they bore. Many prostitutes raised children in secret or sent them to foster families, clinging to the fragile hope that their sons and daughters might live free from the stigma that defined their own lives. The bond of motherhood offered a purpose that no brothel keeper could exploit, a love that endured beyond shame. Their hidden lives were not only tales of despair but also of resistance. Every coin saved, every friendship forged, every laugh shared in the face of cruelty was a reminder that even in the most oppressive systems, humanity persisted. These women were not merely victims, they were survivors, crafting lives from the fragments left to them, making choices however limited, and seeking dignity in a world determined to deny it. In these quiet acts of resilience, the prostitutes of the Middle Ages remind us of a deeper truth, that history is not only the tale of kings and wars, but also of forgotten women who endured in silence, fought in whispers, and claimed small freedoms where none were meant to exist. The story of medieval prostitution does not end in the shadowed brothels or the plague-ridden streets. Its legacy stretches far beyond the Middle Ages, shaping laws, morality, and the way societies view women and sexuality even today. To understand this legacy is to see how deeply woven the trade was into the fabric of medieval life, and how its echoes still haunt us centuries later. Prostitution in the Middle Ages was never simply about sex. It was about power, who controlled it, who profited from it, and who bore its costs. Rulers taxed it, bishops licensed it, and merchants exploited it. The women themselves carried the weight of condemnation, branded as sinners while simultaneously sustaining an economy of desire that no authority could abolish. This paradox left a long shadow. In many ways, it established a model of double standards that persisted: men's sins excused, women's punished. The laws created to regulate prostitution left deep imprints: restrictions on clothing, bans on certain neighborhoods, and rules about when and how women could work became precursors to later regulations in Europe. The French gabelle of salt had its mirror in the tax of flesh, where women's very bodies were turned into sources of revenue. Even when moral tides shifted in later centuries, when Protestant reformers closed brothels or Catholic authorities intensified crackdowns, the pattern remained. Prostitution was alternately condemned and tolerated, but never eradicated. The Church's stance, too, left a lasting contradiction. By branding prostitution as a necessary evil, theologians like Aquinas ensured that the stigma of the trade endured while simultaneously normalizing its existence. Women bore the mark of Eve, temptress, corrupter, sinner, while men who purchased their services remained largely invisible in the moral equation. This skewed moral balance carried forward, influencing attitudes toward sexuality, sin, and women's roles in society for generations. Culturally, the figure of the prostitute became a powerful symbol. In literature and art, she was portrayed as both seductress and warning, the fallen woman whose beauty concealed ruin. Medieval ballads and tales often used prostitutes as cautionary figures, their fates reinforcing the lesson that female desire must be controlled, punished, or redeemed through suffering. Yet, in some stories, they also appeared as tragic heroines, women whose humanity broke through the chains of stigma, offering glimpses of compassion amid cruelty. The legacy was also written in blood and suffering. The diseases that ravaged prostitutes and their clients reshaped public health in Europe, forcing governments to confront questions of regulation and morality. The violence endured by women in the trade, rarely punished, reinforced the idea that some lives were worth less than others. That legacy of exclusion, vulnerability, and silence remains a haunting reminder of the injustices carried forward from the medieval world. And yet, amidst this darkness, the resilience of these women shines through. Their hidden acts of survival, their sisterhoods, their ability to carve out small freedoms within systems built to crush them. All of this speaks to a legacy of endurance. They were not only exploited, but also resourceful, not only condemned, but also remembered, if only in fragments. Their story is not just one of oppression, but also of defiance, of living in spite of the world's judgment. Today, when we debate prostitution, morality, and women's rights, we are still speaking in the echoes of the Middle Ages. The contradictions, tolerance and condemnation, necessity and sin, survival and shame, remain with us. To study medieval prostitution is to hold a mirror to our own world and to see that the questions of power, desire, and morality that haunted the past continue to shape the present. The brothels are gone, their doors closed centuries ago, but their shadows remain. In the dim lamplight of history, the faces of medieval prostitutes still gaze back at us, nameless, forgotten by chroniclers, yet alive in the truths they reveal. Their legacy is a testament not only to the cruelty of their world, but to the resilience of women who endured, survived, and left behind a story too powerful to be erased.